Thank you very much, Lisa. I'm always astounded by these introductions because I keep asking myself, who is that guy? Kind of thing. I'm also very grateful, in fact, to the Linda Hall Library for bringing me to Kansas City, as is my mother, 96 years old a couple of weeks ago, because she grew up in Kansas City. So she insisted that I come to Kansas City, in fact. I used to come here a lot when I was much younger. Anyhow, we're going to talk a little bit about why we think they're out there and how we're looking for them and what it would mean to you, the car buyer, if we were to find the aliens. I always ask, and I will ask tonight, how many of you think that there are aliens to be found? Okay, I won't count those, but how many of you think probably not? All right, well, you're the ones I really want to talk to later, you know. I was sort of wondering why you didn't even listen. Well, let me. Yeah. Okay. There we go. All right. Let me just say, give you a few suggestions as to why. If you were to grab the next 10 astronomers off the streets of Kansas City, and that's not a good idea, but if you were to do that and ask them, do you think that the aliens are out there? Probably 9 out of the 10 would say yes. Part of the reason is evidence like this. This is a picture I made in northwest Australia, the Pilbara Hills, a number of years ago now. There's a business card there so you get some idea of the scale. This rock is the oldest well-preserved sedimentary rock in the world, actually. And we know how old the rock is from radioactive dating. It's about 3.5 billion years old. Okay, there's very little, uncertainty about that, 5% or 3% or something. But you might be able to see if I can get the right, yeah. You see these sort of round structures here that look like cauliflowers in the rock. Those are the remains of bacteria that lived 3.5 billion years ago. They're what are called stromatolites. They're just colonies that the bacteria made, and still do make today, actually. It was controversial for a while, but the point is that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. That's a number that's worth remembering, by the way. You can use it at your next cocktail party, and you may impress somebody. But by 3.5 billion years ago, there was already life all over the place. Okay? We don't know when the first life appeared. A lot of people work on that. It may have been as early as 4 billion years ago, conceivably even earlier than that. The point here being that almost as soon as the Earth was formed, life developed. And that suggests, doesn't prove, but it does suggest that life wasn't terribly improbable. It didn't take a long time to get this project going. Okay, so that's one thing. You could say, well, okay. Now, the other big argument for why the aliens may be out there is that the universe is big, really big. Okay, now there's a picture of, these aren't stars. These little dots this is part of a survey that's made of galaxies. Each one of those dots is a galaxy. Now, if you don't recall what a galaxy is just a big neighborhood of stars. Typical galaxy, like our own Milky Way, has a few 100 billion stars in it. So each one of those dots is a few 100 billion stars. Okay? And you can see there are a lot of them. And in fact, the number of galaxies we can see with our telescopes is on the order of 100 billion. So I'm sure you've probably multiplied those two numbers together on the back of the shirt of the guy in front of you. That's, unless you're in the front row. And that turns out to be 10,000 billion stars within our purview. There undoubtedly is a lot more to the universe, maybe an infinite more, a degree of more stuff. But there's at least that much. That's a 1 followed by 22 zeros. That's the number of stars that we can see. Okay, that's a big number. That's like the number of grains of sand on all the beaches of America. Okay, never mind that. There you go. That's the number of galaxies, 10 to 22 stars. Now, the point is that life won't cook up on a star, obviously. It's a little bit too toasty. It'll have to cook up on a planet. And up until 1995, the only planets we knew about were the ones you see depicted in the exhibits here in the library, the 9, now 8, that orbit the sun. Okay. Now, when I was a kid, which was sometime before the Crimean War, I would go to the Hayden Planetarium in New York, and they would tell you things like, well, the way the planets were formed here was because another star got close to our sun and ripped some gas out of it, and that made the planets. That turns out not to be right. But had it been right, this would be the only solar system in the whole galaxy. Right? Now, not too many astronomers bought that because there's something called the principle of mediocrity in astronomy. And I always thought it referred to the astronomers themselves. In fact, it does. But what it really is saying is that if you think that you're very special, you're probably wrong. Right? Okay. So beginning in 1995, we began to find planets around other stars, real other ordinary stars, not by actually seeing them, but by doing this little trick here. there's a little cartoon showing a planet going around a star. Seeing the planet is very hard. Typically finding these planets, and you probably heard Sarah Seeger talk about this, it's difficult because a planet like the Earth only shines with about 1/10,000,000th of the brightness of the sun. So, the difficulty is not that you can't build a telescope that's powerful enough to pick up that light, but it's right next to a very bright light, namely a star. That you can't see, but what you can see is maybe the dance that you induce in the star when a planet orbits it, because the star doesn't just sit there. It dances a little bit depending on the mass and the distance of the planet going around it. So you get data like these, in which you see a star, in this case 51 Pegasi, but you can see it comes at you at about the speed at which you drive your bicycle down Ward Parkway. Then it goes away from you, and then it comes toward you, and so forth. And that dance is the indication of planets around other stars. Now, we found about 400 and some of these planets around other stars. So those of you who read the newspapers or remember what a newspaper is, will occasionally see these stories about planets having been found around other stars. The number 450 is a large number compared to the 8 in our solar system, but that's actually not the interesting thing. The interesting thing you want to know is, but what fraction of stars have planets? Okay, and I was going to tell you about him, but we don't know. Well, no, I will tell you about that. We don't know that, but this guy in the upper left corner, a guy by the name of Jeff Marcy, is the foremost hunter of planets these days. He lives in the Bay Area near San Francisco. He's at UC Berkeley, and he's been looking for these wobbles in stars for a long time now. And I asked him just a couple of months ago, I said, Jeff, we found 450 planets, but if you had perfect telescopes, what fraction of stars do you think would show these wobbles? Right? And Jeff said, oh, well, on the basis of the statistics we have so far, I would say maybe a half or 3/4. Now, to an astronomer, a half is the same as all, right? And astronomy, you don't usually worry about factors of 2. So that's what gives you this number down at the bottom. In our own galaxy, about 1 trillion planets orbit stars, on the order of 1 trillion. Now, that's a pretty big number. By the way, the number of planets that are not orbiting stars, that have gotten kicked out of their solar systems and are just wandering around, like pariahs or whatever, between the stars is probably 3 or 4 times that number. But never mind that. Those guys may not be where you want to live. So that's a big number. And again, if you don't like our own galaxy, if for some reason our own galaxy doesn't appeal to you, you can always move to one of the 100 billion other ones we can see. So these numbers are so big that, it's kind of encouraging. This is an experiment going on now. This is the Kepler telescope launched by NASA a little over a year ago. And Kepler's mission is to find out what fraction of stars have planets that are cousins of the Earth. In other words, the right size, the right distance from their suns to have maybe liquid oceans, thick atmospheres, and maybe, something alive. Okay. It's going to answer that question in the next 1,000 days. Right? It's going to happen. The thing works, so it will happen. All right, and maybe it'll turn out that Earths are very rare. Nobody figures that. They figure that maybe 1% of all stars will have Earths, maybe 2%, maybe 0.5%. We don't know, but this experiment's going to answer that question. And this is actually a very interesting thing because no previous generation could do this experiment, and no subsequent generation has to do it. This is a one-off deal. It's very much like what happened at the beginning of the 16th century. Right? At the time of Columbus, if you had made a globe of the Earth, right, most people realized the Earth was a globe, and try to fill it out, you'd have Europe, and you'd have most of Africa, and you'd have some of Asia, and that would be it. Most of the globe would be blank. In one generation, we were able to map the globe, right? Almost all of it. We're missing things like Antarctica and some islands here and there, but basically the globe was mapped by one generation. No previous generation could do that, and no subsequent generation had to bother, right? It was just done forever. And of course, we continue to make maps, and they're better maps, but the fundamental work was done by one generation, and that's what this instrument here is going to do. It's going to answer this question: what fraction of stars have planets where you might consider building condos, if you will? Okay. That's the estimated result, but this is a guess on the basis of the people that have been doing this experiment. Okay, now let me talk a little bit about intelligent life, and start with intelligent life that might be nearby, because that's what we always hoped. This is Percival Lowell here, came from a Boston Brahmin family. This photo is more than 100 years old now. Lowell grew up in well, in Massachusetts, right? He was a fairly wealthy family he grew up in, and he went to Harvard, studied mathematics. He was apparently one of the best students that Harvard ever had. One of his, of course, that's only Harvard, but one of his one of his brothers actually was the president of Harvard for a long time. And he was really interested in astronomy. He could have taken a job at a third-rate, university somewhere and hoped for tenure, but he had money, so he didn't have to do that. He just built his own observatory. In fact, he sent out a bunch of astronomers. He said, "Find me the best place to build an observatory where the atmosphere is stable and all that." And they came back. I think the answer was Argentina or something like that. And he said, "Think again." So they thought again, and they came up with Flagstaff, Arizona. And so he built an observatory there in Flagstaff. He modestly named it the Lowell Observatory. He did a lot of good work. The Lowell Observatory is still in biz, by the way, continues to do excellent research. But one of the things that Lowell got involved in were these claims that there were canals on Mars. These had been seen by Italians beginning in the 1860s and the 1870s. Of course, the Italians were very cagey about it all. They called them canali, which, of course, was probably appropriate since they were in Italy. But it was unclear whether they meant real canals dug by, Martians looking for shovel-ready projects, or whether these were just some sort of, natural channels caused by who knows what. Anyhow, so they one day they'd say one thing, the next day they'd say something else. But Lowell looked at these things, and he was convinced that the canals existed and were for real. This is some of his handiwork. You can see some of the 400 and some canals that I guess it was more like 200 and some, close to 300. Canals that he mapped and gave nice Latin names in case the Martians hadn't bothered. And in fact, he wrote several books around 1900 in which he described all this work. And also, he explained why the Martians were engaged in all this civil engineering, all this trench work. The answer was, of course, that Mars was a dying, drying planet, which happens to be true, and they were compelled to dig these canals to bring water from the polar regions down to the equatorial territories where they would grow their Brussels sprouts or whatever it was that the Martians were chowing down on. Now, among his many talents, Lowell was a very good writer, and so the public believed this. The astronomical community was very doubtful, and in particular, where I live in the Bay Area, there was a bigger telescope than Lowell had on Mount Hamilton, the Lick Observatory. And these guys would look at Mars, and we don't see any canals. And he said, "Your problem is you're not in Flagstaff," right? Well, that may have been their problem. Let me just show you. Here's a modern view of Mars of the same area that you see on the left there. And you can see the dark areas, so Lowell got that right. What he didn't apparently get right were the canals, in fact. This is an illustration from a contemporary textbook of astronomy and showing you what it would look like on Mars, okay? And which kind of looks like Santa Monica or maybe Venice, I don't know. And this is from 1908. This is the Martians themselves. You can tell the females because they, wear bows in their hair and have long eyelashes. I guess it's a Martian cocktail party. I'm not quite sure. You see a trend here that goes back obviously quite a ways, and that is that the aliens tend to be anthropomorphic. They tend to look like your neighbors. Right? I mean, if these guys moved in next door, you'd probably get around to inviting them to dinner eventually, right? They're not all that different. Now, actually, what was causing the canals, this is kind of a diversion, but it's sort of interesting. Lowell died in 1916, and he was still convinced that the canals were real, but by then, very few scientists were. Okay, and I think that the real answer to what was causing the canals was determined by this guy, Edward Maunder, who was a researcher actually in the United Kingdom, and he made pictures like the big one there, just a bunch of patterns, a few dots here and there. He just made those by hand. He kind of made them up, and he would put them at the front of a classroom, some school in London, filled with 11-year-old boys, and they were at different distances from the screen, just as you are. And he gave them all sheets of paper and a pencil, and he just said, draw what you see. And at a certain distance from the screen, almost all the boys would connect the dots. They were drawing lines. So this says something about our retina and our visual system. You like to connect the dots. That probably helps you to catch dinner, or did 100,000 years ago. Right? So Maunder published these results. Now, Lowell, of course, was unconvinced, but most of the rest of the world was. That's probably what caused the canals. In the mid-1970s, of course, we got close-up views of Mars, including this one. Remember the Viking landers that plopped down onto the rusty, dusty surface of our little ruddy buddy there, making these kinds of pictures. And it doesn't look anything like that textbook illustration. You don't see too many canals. And in fact, somewhat to the dismay of the people who were running this experiment, NASA, they didn't see any life, in fact. Remember, this was an exciting time. It was 1976, I believe. And the shutters opened for the first time on a camera that's sitting on Mars. And nobody knew what they were going to see. It might be little green guys waving, maybe some lichen, maybe some plants, something. And what it saw was this. And the picture never changed. Day after day, for months they took pictures. The picture never changed. Sort of like that joke, if you're not the lead dog, the view never changes. Well, the view never changed on Mars. You have to think about that. The view never changed on Mars. You try doing this in your backyard, right? Take pictures every day of your backyard. The view will change. The grass will grow, dogs will walk by, there'll be an insect here or there. I don't know, but something will happen. Not on Mars. It looked like Mars, it was dead, Jim. It was dead. Okay. Now, mind you, there was a guy at Caltech, Norm Horowitz, who said at the time, he said, well, it could be that there's life on Mars that looks like rocks. But as we now know, these are rocks. Okay, so it looked bad. But I do want to point out, I don't want to spend too much time describing stupid life, because that's what this is all about. But we shouldn't give up on Mars. That was a very discouraging thing. For a long time, the whole idea of life in space kind of went into remission for a while, or at least it was at a subdued level, is what I mean to say. Because, here Mars, our best hope for company here nearby, looked dead. But it may not be. The picture on the left here was taken by an orbiter in 1999 around Mars. It just shows the side of a crater. And on the right-hand side, you see the same crater 6 years later. And you see that white streak down there. Okay. Well, we don't know what it is. It could be talcum powder, it could be a whole bunch of things. But most likely it's caused by water that leaches out of the side of the crater and ran down before it sublimated, went up into the air. So it looks like what you really want to do in order to find life on Mars is send Bruce Willis to the red planet with a bunch of drilling guys. Maybe they can get labor cheap from BP now, and just drill down a couple of 100 feet, and because there seem to be aquifers down there, and just pull up that muck and look at it under a microscope and see if you see microbes, because there's plenty of biota, there are plenty of living organisms underneath the ground here. I don't mean a foot underneath the ground, I mean a mile under the ground. Even 2 miles under Kansas City, there's a lot of life. Right? Obviously, it doesn't work with photosynthesis, but there's a lot of life down there. Okay, and if you just drill a 1 mile deep hole and pull up the stuff, you'll find these microbes. Okay, so maybe on Mars. This is another place we might look for life. This is a moon, it looks like a giant tennis ball, which it isn't. This is the moon of Saturn called Titan, but it has smog. It's a lot of hydrocarbons. This is a picture of the same place seen with radar, so you begin to see something there. And this is also a radar photo of Titan. This is a fairly recent one, showing these lakes. There are lakes on this moon around Saturn. It's really cold out around Saturn. On a warm day here, it'll be minus 200 or so. Okay, they're really cold. So these are not lakes. These are liquid lakes. We know they're liquid now. These are not lakes of water, obviously. They're lakes of liquid natural gas, ethane and methane, right? Kind of stuff you use, to cook dinner, right? And in fact, there's a proposal out now. One guy at Washington State University in Pullman, he's proposing to NASA that they send a mission to Titan and they drop a boat about maybe this size onto one of these lakes with cameras and other devices to try and find life on Titan. Because even though it's very cold, it is liquid, and it's carbon chemistry. There may be something there. The only thing you can think of that's kind of bad is that it's very cold, so the chemistry goes slowly, but still. So we may find life nearby. There are at least 7 other worlds in our own solar system that are thought to have either liquid water or, in this case, liquid of some sort. 7 other worlds. In a solar system with only 8 planets, about 160 moons. A lot of those are moons, but still. And you may remember in 1996, the biggest science news story of 1996. You remember that Martian meteorite? It was on the front page of the New York Times with font that you could read from low-flying aircraft. I mean, that was a big story for 3 or 4 days. And I remember my neighbor saying, yeah, well, these guys are claiming they found dead pond scum on Mars. I got live pond scum in my bathtub. Why are my tax dollars paying for this? That kind of attitude. The guy didn't get it, but my neighbors never do. The point was, if you were to find life on Mars, dead or alive, right, that would tell you right away that life's not a miracle, right? It's just a cosmic infection, if you will, right? If the next planet out also had life, unless that planet infected ours, which is possible. But anyhow, all right, What about intelligent life? What about intelligent life? The public believes, and I know that there are representatives of MUFON here in the audience tonight, the public believes that there's not only intelligent life out there, but it's here, right? Occasionally buzzing the countryside or abducting you for experiments that may not be appropriate on a first date. Now, you may gauge, you may gauge a lot of things, but if you may gauge from that comment that I'm not one of those who think they're here. That would be great for me. It's not that I'm against the idea, because after all, it would be job security for me if the aliens were, walking the streets of Overland Park, okay? I don't think that the evidence is convincing. I mean, it doesn't violate physics for them to come here. It's not that it's impossible. It's hard. It's really hard. But I think that if they were here, personally, I think if they were here, the evidence would be good. I don't think it's very good. So these people say, forget the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. Forget trying to do experiments to find them out there. They're here. Okay? Now, this is not a fringe belief, of course. This is a fairly widespread. I just show you this. This is my favorite UFO photo, I have to say. But I made this photo in my garage. This is a lampshade I found in an abandoned shopping cart. Okay, over here, the results of a poll, a CNN Times poll from, I believe, 2002. Do you think a UFO crash landed in Roswell, New Mexico in 1947? 65% of Americans say yes. Right, the aliens, I mean, most of the UFO crowd actually doesn't believe this, but anyhow, the aliens come, who knows how many hundreds of light years to visit New Mexico because, I don't know, Tex-Mex cuisine, not sure, but they come all that distance, and then in the last 50 feet, they make a navigation error and crash into the dirt. Okay? So, could happen, but. Is the U.S. government hiding the fact that it knows of the existence of aliens? 80% of the public says yes, right? 80%. Okay, mind you, this is the same, how long did they keep Anita Hill quiet? What is that, 2 weeks? This has been going on for more than 60 years. This is the same government that runs the IRS, but somehow they've kept this quiet. Now, you may believe that. I mean, Americans love to think that their government is keeping secrets from them, and for its part, the government makes sure that it keeps some secrets just to keep you interested, right? But even if you want to believe that our government has this vast conspiracy to keep the most interesting science story of all time secret from you for some reason, right? Presumably because you'd riot. 80% believe it's true. They're not rioting about that. 7% of Americans think they've been abducted, right? That's perfectly okay. That's okay, dear. I notice that you disappear from the bedroom for a couple of hours every week or so, but it's all right. It's, even if you believe that our government is complicit in this, it's hard for me to believe that the Belgians and the Botswanans and the Bulgarians and the Brazilians and, that they're all keeping it quiet too. Because you have to assume that that's the case. Otherwise, you have to make the argument that the aliens only visit American. Here's one argument against this. This is a very simple argument. Going into space, from one star to the next, is very difficult, right? This isn't a problem of engineering. Our rockets go at 7 miles a second, okay? Now, 7 miles a second is great if you're going to Topeka. It's unclear why you'd want to. But 7 miles a second is great if you're going to the moon. If you're going to Mars, you can get all there, get to the moon in a couple of days, get to Mars in a couple of months. Even if you wanted to go to Jupiter or Saturn, you get there in a few years. 7 miles a second, that's okay. But if you go to the nearest other star, where presumably the moon Pandora is, right? If you go there, at that speed, it takes you, this calculation is slightly wrong, but it should be actually 110,000 years, not 75,000 years, to the nearest other star. But what the heck? 75,000 years, 110,000 years. That's a long time to be sitting there with your tray table and seat back in their fully upright position, eating pretzels off your lap. So, now you might say, okay, well, great. I understand that this is trivial because obviously they've got better rockets. Well, of course. And we'll have better rockets too, but there is a physics problem. The physics problem is there are several of them. One is the amount of energy required to go fast. If you want to get to the nearest star in 10 years, you need a rocket that can go about half the speed of light. Right? The energy required to send something the size of the upper floors of this library to the nearest star at half the speed of light is more energy than the entire U.S. burns up in a century. It's a lot of energy. It's a lot of coal. Or whatever. Okay. And the other problem is when you're going at those great speeds, of course, all the interstellar particles are hitting the front of your ship and making, high-speed, deadly radiation that'll rip right through the ship and give everybody instant cancer. So there are a lot of problems. But, as I say, it doesn't violate physics. It's just hard. Okay. Now, here's too bad about a different version of PowerPoint. Never mind. Here's another thing. I often ask, why is it that the aliens are here now? Just in time to maybe improve your social life by abducting you for these salacious experiments, right? Because after all, the Earth has been here for 4.5 billion years, and there's been life on it for 4 billion years. I mean, they could have visited the trilobites, right, or the bivalves, or the dinosaurs or something, but they've come just in time for you. Right? 10,000 generations of Homo sapiens, and doggone it, you luck out, because here they are. Now, you could assume, well, they've always been here, in which case they've been pretty unremarkable. I mean, it's hard to find much archaeological evidence of that, but okay. The other thing is that people will say, well, they're here now because they're disgusted with our behavior, right? Like they don't like what we're doing in the environment, or they don't like the fact we got nuclear weapons, or they have some other interest in us. Now, personally, I find that kind of a stretch. I mean, I don't go in the backyard and separate the ants. You guys have been having wars all this time. I've had enough of it, I mean, it's not something I spend a lot of time with. The other thing is, they don't know about any of that stuff. Now, here you see I Love Lucy, right? And the first episode of I Love Lucy, I believe was 1953, but, within a few years, that's right, in any case. 1953, so that's 57 years ago. So those signals, I Love Lucy, the first episodes of I Love Lucy are washing over a news star system at the rate of about one a day. You'd think that the sponsors would be happy about that, but I don't know. Okay, our most powerful the signals that we've been broadcasting into space, we've been doing this for a while, go back a little earlier than I Love Lucy, say 60 years, 70 years. So evidence of our presence is 60 light years out into space. That's the only way the aliens really could find us if they're that far away, right? They couldn't find the Romans. Right? They couldn't even find the Victorians. They could only find us if they're within 60 light years because they could pick up some of these broadcasts, right? Radars are actually the strong signal, but never mind. Well, that means they can't be more than 30 light years away to have picked up the signals, decided they don't like Fred Mertz's jokes, hop into a spacecraft that goes 99.99% the speed of light, and then come down here to haul you out of your bedroom. Okay? Now, how many stars are within 30 light years? Well, only a couple of thousand. That's not many, right? In fact, that's a pretty small number. So I think it's safe to say, I will make this as a categorical statement in a talk which is singularly free of categorical statements, but that I don't think that any other species knows about the existence of Homo sapiens except other species here on Earth. Right? They don't know we're here. They know we're here. Right? So it is rather remarkable they've come now. Okay, they simply don't know. What they will know is that Earth has life because we've had oxygen in our atmosphere for a long time, and oxygen is caused by photosynthesis, the oxygen in our atmosphere now. We also have methane and so forth, which is caused by what are politely called bovine flatulence or porcine flatulence. So they would know there are pigs in space, pigs on Earth and so forth. But they wouldn't know about you because that signal hasn't gotten to them yet. Okay. The other thing that I find interesting about the whole phenomenon of are they here or not is that it's highly emotional. Highly emotional. And this is perplexing to me. I get phone calls and emails every day from people who have something to show me that proves that the aliens are here. Every day. And I usually direct them to MUFON, by the way, so MUFON's here. But, but it's very emotional. It's very emotional. I don't know why. Actually, if anybody who buys my book will find there's actually a whole section there on why it might be emotional. All right. So let me skip from that to the question of how we're looking for ET. One of the big, controversial, contentious even, aspects of this problem is, look, maybe life is very common. Making bacteria might be something that a lot of planets have managed to do. But what about intelligent life? If I give you 1 million worlds that has life and you let it cook for a few billion years, will it ever produce something like you, right, functionally equivalent to you? Now, the first thing you have to ask is, well, what do you mean by intelligence anyhow? I mean, is there intelligence inside the beltway or whatever, right? Now, what we mean by intelligence is really simple. It's an operational definition. If you can build a radio transmitter, you're intelligent, right? So ask the person sitting next to you, hey, can you build a radio transmitter? And you know how to treat them as you're walking out the door here. Okay, here's a guy. See, here's a guy who 30,000 years after this photo was made, will be building a radio transmitter. So you can tell he's intelligent. He's adding some RAM to his computer there. Okay, now, is intelligence... That joke usually turns audiences against me, but I figure it's too late. Okay. we don't know whether intelligence is commonplace or not. Stephen Jay Gould, for example, was very skeptical about this. He said, look, rewind the tapes of Earth and play everything different, play them again with slightly different, thunderstorms here and there, and you wouldn't have humans here. Or, a very obvious example, 65 million years ago, right, this big rock slams into the Yucatan down in Mexico and wipes out, 2/3, 3/4 of all species. Now, if that rock had arrived, 20 hours earlier, it would have missed the Earth, and you wouldn't be sitting through this. There would be dinosaurs in Kansas City, okay? All right, so there is the question, yeah, but maybe something else would have evolved to be intelligent, and that's the question. So there are a whole bunch of people who study this, not a whole bunch, total number is fewer than in half of any row in here, but anyhow, that's a whole bunch in this field, studying the question of what caused our ancestors to get smart, okay? Here's, for example, a bit of evidence in that line. This is from Lori Marino, who's a biologist down at Emory in Atlanta. And what she's done is she's looked at the IQs of cetaceans, dolphins, toothed whales, things like that. And she estimates their intelligence on the basis. she couldn't get their SAT scores, but what she does is she just looks at the volume of their cranial cavity, compares it to their body size and so forth. That turns out to be, it seems, a good measure of IQ. So here's, every time you show a graph here, you lose 10% of the audience. Right? Got 12 of these. Okay, so here's the IQ of the cetaceans. On the left, dumb. On the right, smart. 50 million years ago today. So 50 million years ago, there were a bunch of these things, ancestors of modern-day dolphins, and they were pretty stupid. But then they developed echolocation, so they could find fish, and they got smarter, or at least their brains got bigger. And now, some of them got smarter yet, and some of them got dumber. A million years ago, the smartest thing on this planet was a white-flanked dolphin. Today, of course, it's Homo sapiens. But the point of all this is to show, we're not the only species that has increased its average intelligence with time, right? I mean, obviously dolphins, well, also other simians, of course, but, some birds are fairly clever. Octopuses are reputed to be clever. I've never, you go to the local library, you probably won't find much octopus literature here, but still, the fact that various species found a niche for intelligence that helped them survive suggests that it might happen frequently. There's also this kind of work. This is Jeff Miller down at the University of New Mexico. I'll just tell you this story very briefly. What Miller says is that, look, a lot of higher animals reproduce by signaling for fitness. Now, what do I mean by that? Their strategy for reproduction, or at least mate choice, is that the males display and the females decide. Okay? I mean, the guys all know this, that, men are merely a genetic experiment being run by women. True. Now, the canonical example here is the peacocks, right? So the male peacocks have these big blue feathers, and they trip across a female, and, they show these blue feathers. And the female little peahens with their little pea brains looking around, well, I don't know, this guy's blue feathers are pretty good, but, that guy's blue feathers are better. So she takes him home to mom. Now, you got to ask, what's in it to choose the guy with the big blue feathers? Because they don't really have much survival value. In fact, you could argue they have anti-survival value because they just attract predators, right? So that may be a point. I mean, he's still walking around. He must be good, right? This is sort of like Clint Eastwood. I was sort of one of those Clint Eastwood cowboy films. Remember, he would ride into some godforsaken western town, probably hadn't had a shower in 3 months, and the women all turn out, and I always wonder, why? What do they want to have anything to do with this guy? And the biologists say, look, if he made it this far, he's good. Okay, so same thing happened with Captain Cook in the South Pacific. I mean, all right. Anyhow, but the point is that those blue feathers are hard to grow, metabolically hard to grow, and if there are lots of mutations in the guy's genome, then he can't grow the blue feathers. So what the peahen gets out of this is healthy chicks. Okay, so what Miller says is, look, hominids, we got the same deal, right? Except we don't have the blue feathers, but our brains are very tightly wired into our genome, and your genome, about half of your genome has some effect on the way your brain is wired up. So what the males ought to do is when you go to a party, you just take off your skull and you pass your brain around all the women, so check it out, right? Now that's considered a social blunder, so we don't do that, but if the guy can, sing or tell jokes or, I don't know, something, the women are listening with their ears. Well, Bob here is kind of interesting, but Melvin over here, he's more interesting, so she goes home with Melvin. Now, it isn't because she's interested in, and thereby, of course, raises the average IQ of the males. It isn't because the women are interested in smart men. Don't flatter yourself. That's not it. It just have fewer genetic, mutations. That's all that it's about. So, a guy like this is popular. And of course, now Miller usually gets the comment, so why'd the women get smart? And he said, look, the females are under tremendous evolutionary pressure to be charismatic and so forth so that the males don't wander off and bring all the meat back for some other woman's kids, that kind of. Now, not everybody buys this, but Miller will tell you, says, look, if you doubt this, just pay attention the next time you're in a restaurant and look at the couples. If they're just getting together, the guy's doing all the talking to impress the female. If they've been together for a long time, the woman's doing all the talking to keep the guy from wandering off, at least before he pays the bill. I don't know. Okay. Now, the point of all this little digression, although it might make an amusing story for you to consider later, the point of all this is that this is a very simple mechanism that could be expected to obtain on any world, really. Or something like it. There's nothing miraculous in this. It's just a Darwinian selection mechanism that ratcheted up intelligence. Nonetheless, despite all the arguments that I've made in the past 25 minutes, this was mentioned by Lisa at the beginning, we have not found any compelling evidence of life beyond Earth. And I might say that's, to quote the last president, dead or alive. We haven't. The only life we know about is right here on Earth, okay? Now, I think that's going to change. I think in the next 20 years we're going to find some. We'll see if that's true. And I think it's actually possible that in the next couple of dozen years we're going to find the intelligent variety of life, the Li-T. What would be the clues? Well, maybe, intelligence is probably a lot less common than, say, microbial life. Probably many, many, many more worlds with stupid life, if you will, than intelligence. And NASA is looking for unintelligent life, right? Microbes on Mars and so on. That's where all the big money goes. The government money is all looking for, essentially, life that probably requires a microscope to see, okay? On the assumption that, microbial life, stupid life, if you will, is much more commonplace than intelligent life, and certainly when I walk my neighborhood in California, it seems to be the case. Now, but on the other hand, intelligent life to begin with might be more interesting, right? You might find a peer. But beyond that, it might be doing something that makes it easier to find. For example, you could look for artifacts. Here's one of the photos from the Apollo mission that NASA never released on the assumption you wouldn't find it interesting. Now, look, obviously this is some work I do with Photoshop, but if you actually did find something like this, you can say, well, I don't know, Ralph, but it doesn't look natural to me. And it doesn't. All right. So this would be a legitimate thing. Maybe our solar system was visited, 300 million years ago, and they said, well, they've got a fair amount of flora and fauna here. Who knows? Why don't we just spend the extra $10 and leave this time capsule in case? Right, so that if they ever find it, they'll know how to join our book club or whatever. Okay. And you could leave that time capsule on the Earth, but the Earth is cursed with weather and plate tectonics and other things that kind of chew up the landscape all the time. So it'd be better to leave it on the moon. So you could consider digging up the moon. We don't have the money to do that, but this is a legitimate approach. You could look for astroengineering. Keep in mind, the universe is 3 times as old as the Earth. Right. Most of the stars, 2/3 of the stars you see out there, 2/3 of them are older than the sun. Right? So there's been plenty of time for other societies to get not just millions of years ahead of us, but even billions, if they can live that long, right? So, maybe some of them are doing stuff that's so spectacular that we might just find it in the course of normal astronomical observation, like a ring world here, like Larry Niven's idea. That may be possible. Or a Dyson swarm. Freeman Dyson suggested that what you really want to do is, instead of burning oil and gas and coal and stuff like that, is you just want to build a whole swarm of solar cell satellites and, encircle your own star with them, have them beam all the energy down back to you, and that way you get, it's 10 trillion times as much energy as we're using now, right? So, that would be enough to power your iPod and everything else, 10 trillion times. So he said, why not look for these sorts of things out in space? And there have been some efforts. That's, again, legitimate. It sounds far out, but literally. But it's actually a good approach. And then, of course, there's the approach that Jodie Foster pursued in the movie Contact. How many of you saw this movie? Okay. Well, yeah, there's Jodie down at the Very Large Array in New Mexico, which, by the way, has never been used for this. And she's wearing a pair of earphones. I was one of the consultants for the film, I said. And I told Warner Brothers, I told them a lot of stuff, and they ignored it all. But what... I said, this is wrong, because at that time we were monitoring 56 million channels. I said, you've got to put 28 million pairs of earphones on Jody. And they demurred. They said, we're not going to do it. It's going to crowd the shot. Anyhow. But actually, this film was fairly accurate in general in terms of portraying what we do, my day job, listening for ET on the radio. Not going there, that's hard. Not waiting for them to come here, that's chancy. But simply finding them in situ, find them at home by picking up signals they may be broadcasting into space. Now, that idea goes back 50 years this month, or last month, really, when Frank Drake did the first experiment in West Virginia. And we still haven't found a signal, and I'll get back to that. Now, I show this picture. This is just a contrast with Jody there. This is the real deal here. This is down in Puerto Rico at the Arecibo antenna. This photo is about 10 years old now. And we were observing using that antenna. And as you can see, there are computers here. The computers are doing the listening. I don't have any earphones on. Right? As I said, we had 56 million channels. The computers don't need a coffee break. They don't mind monitoring 56 million channels. Obviously, it's all done by computers. And in fact, that carbon-based life form over here, it wouldn't actually be necessary to have them there if the equipment were a little bit more reliable, which it is now. But even then, it was reliable enough that most of the time I would just sit there making self-portraits for my mom, like this one. Okay, so that's what it actually looks like. Now, people will ask, what kind of signal are you looking for? Right? People are either looking for the value of pi, or maybe the Fibonacci series prime numbers, perhaps. Well, all that works in the movies, but you don't need any of that. And in fact, you don't even want any of that, because if you have the technology that can pick up alien signals, you probably know the value of pi. Right? It'd be kind of disappointing. Well, we finally heard from the aliens, and they told me something I learned in 7th grade. We don't actually care what the message is. We're not looking for it. In fact, our equipment can't even find it in general. Okay. We're looking for what are called narrowband signals. Now, this is a little bit of signal from down in Puerto Rico, actually, 20 megahertz and so forth. But you see these narrowband signals, the ones that are at one spot on the radio dial. Those are the kinds of signals that transmitters make. Radio, television, they all have narrowband signal components. And those are the kinds of things that are not made by quasars or pulsars or galaxies, hot gas, cold gas. They make signals that are all over the dial. Think of it. Nature's not very good at engineering radio transmitters, right? I mean, you're driving around. You could have been driving around today listening to your car radio, and maybe you're listening to your favorite country and western station or whatever, right? That's at one spot on the dial. But when a lightning bolt went off, and there were plenty of them near my hotel this afternoon, you would hear crackling. You hear a crack in your radio, right? And it doesn't matter where you're tuned. You could hear it anywhere in the dial. So that's the difference between natural static and something from a transmitter. And so we look for these narrowband signals. Okay. I also want to point out we've only occasionally listened. This is a picture of the Arecibo telescope I made at night there. But in any case, people think you've been doing this for 50 years and you haven't found anything, right? Shouldn't you be at least discouraged or maybe ashamed? My mom will call up and say, when are you going to get a real job? Kind of thing. But there's no reason for being discouraged, because we've only barely scratched the surface, because we've always had to use somebody else's antenna. This is a privately funded thing, right? There's no government money funding this. It's been private since 1993. We would borrow this antenna. This is the one down in Puerto Rico again. It's 1,000 feet across. If you haven't seen this, you ought to go down there and look at it, because there's some threat to it, to funding for this. The government may actually start funding this, in which case they may just unbolt it and cart it away. It'll hold 4 billion scoops of Baskin-Robbins ice cream, although not a good idea in the tropics. It's very sensitive because it's very big. But in all the time we've been doing this, the number of star systems we've looked at carefully over a wide range of frequencies is fewer than 1,000. It's fewer than 1,000. In a galaxy of 200, 300, 400 billion stars, we've looked at fewer than 1,000. Right? So, some people make a big deal about this. They say there's an eerie silence and so forth. There's no eerie silence. We just haven't. It's like going to Africa in search of megafauna, right? And looking at, landing on the west coast of Africa, looking at one city block worth of real estate and say, well, no pachyderms here. I guess it's megafauna free, the entire continent, right? That's completely analogous to what we've done. So you might say, well, it took you 50 years to look at 750 star systems. Isn't this going to take a long time? And that's a question we get all the time. How long is it going to be before we find ET? And that's the title of this talk. Now, I show this picture. This is Frank Drake, and he's the guy who did the first SETI experiment 50 years ago, this month, in fact. He's still working. He'll be 80 this month, actually, Frank. But he still looks like this. He looked like this when he was 10. I have photos. He always looks like this. Frank, I don't know what he eats, but he doesn't age. Anyhow, he comes in every day. He writes this equation down on the board. We don't know what it means, but there it is. And Frank gets this question, when are we going to find ET? And Jill Charter, heads up our SETI works, she gets the question, when are we going to find ET? I get the question, and that almost exhausts the number of scientists involved. But we get this question, we have a couple more. And I notice that everybody gives an answer, but the answer is always the same number of years they expect until they retire, right? So that's telling you something about their psychology, but maybe nothing about this work. All right, here's a better answer. This is an antenna system that we're building in Northern California called the Allen Telescope Array. That's Paul Allen, co-founder of the Microsoft Corporation, along with Bill Gates. And he paid enough money to get this thing started. So there are 42 of these antennas, and they're about 20 foot in diameter. They cover a very wide range of frequencies for those who care about that sort of thing. But the real point of this array, you can actually see me in the photo. I'm flashing my flash down here and accidentally got in the picture. There's Jupiter. The advantage of this thing is it's faster than previous experiments, much faster. That's the point of it. This is what it looks like, from 50 feet up. 42 antennas. We have 42. The idea is to build 350. Actually, now, that could be done in the next 2 years, but it's a money problem. Let me just show you this. This is just a little animation that shows you what it'll be like if you get all 350 built. This is a project together with the University of California at Berkeley, by the way, so they're using it for conventional astronomy at the same time that we use it for SETI. Presumably, if we get all these things built, we'll only have enough money for one employee. There he is. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So at 350, this becomes an incredibly powerful instrument. Incredibly powerful, both for astronomy, conventional astronomy, and for SETI. Okay. All right. So getting to the point here about how long it's going to take us to find ET. This quest has been likened to the matter of finding a needle in a haystack. I don't know how many people do that, but, and somebody will ask, when are you going to find a needle, Bob? I mean, you've been looking at this. It depends on three things. How big is the haystack? In the case of this search, we know how big the haystack is. It's our galaxy, a couple 100 billion stars. 2, how many needles are in there? In the case of our search, we don't know how many societies are out there broadcasting. We don't know the number of needles. And the third thing you need to know is how fast are you going through the hay? Are you going through it with a teaspoon, skip loader, what? Right? Now, that we do know in the case of this exercise, because this plot, these black dots show some metric, some indication of the speed of our search. And you can see it's going up. Right? And for those of you who are still, conscious there, you may notice that this is a semi-log plot. In other words, it's going up exponentially. Kind of an overworked word. The media like to use exponentially. Everything's growing exponentially. But it actually has a real meaning. And this actually is going up exponentially. In fact, it's following Moore's law, which is that line there. Now, Moore's law, Gordon Moore is one of the co-founders of Intel Corporation. He noticed 50 years ago almost now that the number of transistors you can fit on a chip and produce at a given price was doubling every 18 months. What that really means is that the power of your personal computers is doubling every 18 months if you replace them, right? Now, that's an economic law, actually. That's not so much a technical thing. It's because the people who make the computers want you to replace them on the same sort of time scale that you replace your car, right? You replace your car, I don't know how often you replace your car. Depends on how much salt the state of Missouri throws on the roads, but every 3, 4, 5 years you might replace your car. But your computer, it's not suffering all that salt damage. After 5 years, your computer looks just the same as the day you bought it. And so they're figuring, how can we get them to buy a new computer? That one looks perfectly good, right? And the way they can get you to buy a new computer is to make the new one so much more powerful that after 3, 4, 5 years, you don't get any respect at parties anymore because you've got an old computer. It works. It works. So they double. Every 18 months, on average, it doubles. And you notice that the speed of our search doubles every 18 months, too. Which means whatever we do in the next 2 years kind of equals all the previous years put together. And it's because a lot of what we do is just... You still hear me? Probably don't want to. Is because a lot of what we do is digital signal processing. So, of course, it doubles every 18 months. All right, so the bottom line is this. This line tells you how far out into space we can see with an instrument like this new Allen Telescope Array as a function of time. right? So by the year 2012, 2014, we'll have looked out to 100 light years, and then, by 2015, 200 light years, and so forth. The numbers down here are the important things. Those numbers give estimates, and that's a euphemism for guesses, as to how many needles are in the haystack, how many societies are out there broadcasting signals that are wafting through your body as you sit through this soporific presentation. Okay, now we don't know. Carl Sagan figured 1 million, and not billions and billions, but 1 million. If he's right, then we should find ET by 2015. Isaac Asimov figured 670,000. Somehow he could do this to 2 decimal places. I don't know how. All right, so if he's right, it takes till 2022 or something. Frank Drake himself figures he's very conservative. He figures there are only 10,000. In a galaxy of hundreds of billions of stars, there are only 10,000 out there that are broadcasting. But if he's right, then it takes till 2027 or 2028. The bottom line is, if the assumptions that go into this experiment are right, then we're going to find ET in the next 24 years. This is not an experiment that's, like building cathedrals in the Middle Ages, where one generation starts it and then, 4 generations later, maybe you get it up above 20 feet or something, right? If it's going to work at all, if the premise that this is a good way to find out whether we're alone or not is correct, if that has value, then this experiment is going to succeed within your lifetime. And I feel strongly enough about that I bet all audiences, I'll bet you, a cup of Starbucks that we'll find ET within 24 years. So there you go. Either within 24 years, you open up the Kansas City Star, well, all right, you open up your browser and you read, scientists find signal coming from 800 light years away, or you get a cup of coffee. Can't lose. Now, there are always, caveats, maybe we're missing important things. There's a lot of ways this could go wrong. That's why I only bet you a cup of coffee, but I will bet you that much. That'll work. All right, let me just say a few things about what ET, these are speculative things on what ET might be like. For example, people always ask about that. We always assume it's carbon-based. You're carbon-based life forms, Captain. And this is the periodic table. You may remember it from bad experience in 8th grade. You see carbon up there? Carbon. There it is up close. Carbon is a very friendly atom. Has these 4 covalent bonds. It likes to hook up with other atoms, either other carbon atoms, right, and makes a very sort of durable molecules, actually. And, of course, life is just chemistry, right? Didn't they used to say that on TV? Life is just chemistry. And so carbon is actually the best basis for making complex chemistry, at least under the sorts of circumstances we have here on Earth. People often say, yeah, but underneath carbon in the periodic table, we got silicon, and it also has 4 covalent bonds, maybe a silicon-based life. The trouble is that silicon doesn't work nearly as well as carbon. It's because the atom is bigger. Don't worry, the bonds aren't as strong. And, think about it. You take carbon, you hook it up with some oxygen, you get CO2, right, which, despite the problems we're having with CO2 in the atmosphere now, CO2 is a great gas for biology. All the plants love it. You take silicon and you hook it up with a couple of oxygen atoms, and you get Si, silicon dioxide, SiO2, and that's better known as quartz, which you'll find that your plant does not want to breathe, okay? So, silicon maybe under some circumstances, but it's not something. Underneath that is germanium, germanium-based life, tin-based life, maybe in The Wizard of Oz, I don't know, lead, right? So we just assume, ET is probably carbon-based. Homo corrali, wouldn't bother. On a planet with plate tectonics so that they can get some metals and have some technology. Big moon, a good big moon's kind of good at stabilizing the spin of your planet. Having Jupiter around is, you may figure Jupiter's not big in my life, but it's big. And it's big in your life because it's sort of cleaned out the inner solar system of all these big rocks that otherwise would land in Missouri and ruin your whole day. These are all things that we assume about life. They have to have, you see, dolphins, they may be smart, but they're never going to build radio transmitters because they can't hold a pair of pliers, right? And also they live underwater where it's hard to do metallurgy and so forth, stereo vision. These are all things. But what do they actually look like? Well, we don't know. Hollywood does, right? District 9, these guys, they have more or less the same gestures as us, but they don't look all that appealing. They're only, most Hollywood aliens are bad aliens, so they look like things you don't like insects and arthropods and things like that. They're vectors for disease, they're annoying, right? They eat your crops and all that, and you don't like them. And if you were to scale them up, you'd probably like them even less, so Hollywood does that. Mind you, you take an insect and you scale them up by a factor of 10, and now the cross-section of its muscles is 10 by 10, 100 times bigger, so they're 100 times stronger, but unfortunately, their volume has gone up by 10 by 10 by 10, by 1,000 times. So their power-to-weight ratio has gone down by a factor of 10. If you don't follow that, it doesn't matter. But the point is, The point is, if you actually made a bug this big, it would immediately collapse into a very unappetizing heap. But it doesn't matter to Hollywood. Well, then there are the lazy god aliens. I love these kind. These are mostly on television where budgets are smaller. You know, I mean, these are really anthropomorphic guys. I mean, you could make this guy look like somebody you might want your daughter to date if they would only send him to a plastic surgeon, right? They're not all that different from us. You know, God was too lazy to come up with new designs, so it's called lazy god aliens. There's no reason the aliens should look like us. I don't think so. There's some people who do, but I don't think so. Just, you know, take a map of the Kansas City Zoo, you know, put it on the wall, throw a dart at it, and then go visit whatever it is you hit. Unless you hit the primate house, it will not look like you. It'll look like a fish or a snake or a giraffe or something, right? And those are all things that share a lot of your DNA, right? Everything at the zoo probably shares at least 85% of its DNA with you, identical to you. Even a pumpkin. 70% of the DNA in a pumpkin is identical to human DNA. I assume your lifestyle is different than that of a pumpkin, but these guys, right? Do these look like any? I mean, really? Look, they just look like us. Here's your standard alien. It's been pointed out by a biologist that this is just a projection of what we think we are going to become. Right? Another million years, we'll all look like this because we're losing our hair. These guys have gone all the way. We're losing our olfactory sense, our dentition, small noses, small mouths, small bodies because they don't load trucks for a living. And in fact, judging by the eyes, they design websites. That's our future. Could be. I doubt it. So we just assume that the aliens are on worlds that are sort of like ours. There you are. Okay? That's the usual assumption. And that's reflected in our experiments. And what I'm really actually trying to say here is that this may be a little bit too provincial. Maybe a little bit too conservative, okay? We're still picturing the aliens as being something like the Martians of yore, something like us, okay? Now let's look at that sort of more fundamentally. All we require of the aliens is that they be smart, so they have to have intelligence. Your intelligence consists of a 3-pound brain, once described as a slow-speed computer operating in salt water. That's your brain. Okay, now your brain runs at 25 watts, more or less, which is the same power as a fridge light. I point this out to my brother. I always said you were a dim bulb. But actually of interest here is that your entire body runs at like 75 or 100 watts, right? So I don't know how many people are in the room, but each one of you is putting out heat equivalent to about a 75-watt light bulb, which may account for the temperature in here, in fact. That's a lot. But so you run at maybe 75 watts, but 25 watts is going to the 2% of your body that's in your skull. It's very expensive metabolically. You have a hamburger, right? And 1/3 of the calories are going just to keep your brain warm, no matter what you're thinking, if anything at all. Okay, so most men, they're usually in idle mode, okay? So, you know, all right, that's us. But that 3-pound brain, I'm trying to tell you, it's expensive, but on the other hand, it's an improvement over what we had. This is another plot showing the history of brain size for the hominids that became us. So 3 million years ago, your brain weighed 1 pound. 1 million years ago, your brain weighed 2 pounds, and now, as I pointed out, your brain weighs 3 pounds. Now, that last step from 2 pounds to 3 pounds was important because with a 2-pound brain, you're a forest ape. And with a 3-pound brain, you get tenure next door. So, you might think, all right, so what's the point? Well, the point is that maybe this curve just keeps going up. Maybe our descendants will have 5-pound brains or 10-pound brains. I doubt it, because women are already having trouble giving birth to babies with heads as big as they are, and they might just go on strike if you say it's going to have a 10-pound brain eventually, you know. And also there are mechanical problems with a 10-pound brain. You know, you're driving around in your car and somebody's trying to pass you and you turn to see it and you twist your head off, which, you know, discombobulating everybody else in the car. I mean, there are a lot of problems, but this is what we usually assume. The ET will be these big brain guys. They're just us further down the road. But maybe not, because there's this problem. Maybe it's an opportunity. This is a plot by Hans Moravec at Carnegie Mellon. He's a roboticist up in Pittsburgh. And what he's plotted here is just the compute power per $1,000 since 1900. See, it's going up. And the data run out here at 1997. So in 1997, the compute power for $1,000 you buy is equivalent to the compute power of a spider. Right? Today, 2010, you get the compute power of a lizard for $1,000, which is good if you're trying to sell car insurance or something, I don't know. The point of this plot, though, is that by 2020, your desktop computer, your laptop, will have the same compute power as a human brain. Okay, there's no doubt about this. This is, you know, you can take any curve you want here, but that's going to happen. By 2020, your home computer will have the compute power of a human brain. Now people say, well, what happens then? I don't know. I'm just going to turn my keyboard around. You type. I mean, I don't know. Because this doesn't mean that it's thinking, right? To think, you actually have to have the right software. You have to figure out how to emulate thinking in software. And that might take longer. But what's unclear is that it will take infinitely longer, right? Artificial intelligence, as you know, is a big research area, and the people who do it have been predicting they're going to make a thinking machine within 10 years. They've been saying that for many decades now. But they will also say, don't confuse lack of success with lack of progress. We will do it. And when they do it, once they do that, then within 20 years, one computer will have the same compute power as all humans put together. Now, you might think, we'll just keep up by putting chips in our brains. I'm sure we'll do all of that, but it won't allow you to keep up. Now, let me just emphasize this by this little graphic I made. This is the evolution of a horse, right? So 60 million years ago, a horse was about the size of a collie dog. Today, a horse is about the size of a horse. Okay, so that's 60 million years. Over here, personal computers. I had a personal computer in 1977. My computer at home today is, I reckon it's 8,000 times faster than what I had in 1977. So, in other words, in 35 years or so, computers have gotten 10,000 times faster. Right? In 60 million years, Darwinian evolution took a horse from this to that. So it took 60 million years. So you get the point. If you can produce artificial intelligence, and you may say, well, you never do it. You may, I think, delude yourself into saying that. But if you can do it, then, in fact, it very quickly outpaces Darwin. I mean, that's the end of the race. It's not that we disappear, right? It's just that the machines go do their thing. Or who knows? But in any case, it doesn't mean we necessarily disappear. All right. So here's the time scale. You invent radio. We did 100 years ago. You go on the air. Now we can find you. You invent earphones to stay on. And then within 100, 200, 300 years, you invent your successors, because that's what we're doing. So I think if you really want to know what ET is like, you can forget these carbon-based guys like this fellow here, the Arrival. Okay, he looks kind of like us. Must have the same plastic surgeon as Michael Jackson. You can forget these guys, because we're going to invent our successors, and they've already done that. Right? Then what do? Well, Ray Kurzweil figures they might be nanobots, they just spread out and chew up the cosmos. Not much evidence of that happening, but, possibly. The only thing is, this doesn't make sense to me, because now you spread out the intelligence over a great deal of space, and that's not a good thing to do if you really want to be smart, because you want to minimize the time it takes from one idea to get back and forth. But in any case, I think it's much more, only you can prevent Grey goo. I think that the more likely thing is that these intelligences will be very concentrated, made out of whatever the optimal computing material is, called computronium, just as a matter of argument. But the bottom line here is only this, that we're looking for those little gray guys. We continue to think of the aliens as some sort of biological entities, maybe on a planet, and there are billions of them and whatever. They're just sort of like us. But in fact, at the point where they could actually make their presence known, they're almost at the point where they can produce something that's cleverer than themselves and has more capability. And so the odds are that if we find something, that's what we find. Where would they be? Who knows? I don't know. I just suggest this is one place. The center of the galaxy has a lot more energy and matter than we have around here. Maybe they're there. Maybe we should just point our antennas there all the time. We don't do that, but that would be a good strategy. All right, let me just finish up because it's getting late. Let me just finish up by showing this slide. This is the frontispiece from a book about Australia, the history of Australia, called The Fatal Shore by Robert Hughes. I think he was an art critic for the New York Times, but maybe I got that wrong. In any case, he wrote this book. And this is just the frontispiece. But you see here, this is April 1770, and you see Captain James Cook there, right, landing in Botany Bay, which is, 20 or 30 miles south of modern-day Sydney. And the locals, of course, are happy to see the English. Now, what Hughes wrote was that for 40,000 years, there had been a watch glass of isolation sitting over the continent of Australia. Right? And that afternoon in April of 1770, Captain Cook sails into Botany Bay, and that watch glass cracks, and there's no ever putting it together. And what I'm suggesting to you tonight is that in the next 24 years, we're going to see the watch glass of isolation that has sat over our planet for 4.5 billion years crack. And I think that'll be very interesting. Okay, thank you very much.
We have time for a couple of questions. We have a microphone up front and one in the back. If you could raise your hand. Okay.
Yes, I did see you on Larry King Live. Well, the question by Stephen Hawking about the possibly being dangerous for us to contact alien life. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, well, let me say, I mean, I have a lot, well, let me not say all that stuff, background. I don't worry about it. I don't worry about it. You could say, look, advanced aliens won't be hostile, but that falls under the category of alien sociology. And the facts are, the data set for alien sociology is pretty slim, so you can't say categorically they wouldn't be aggressive. Maybe they would be. I mean, I think if they came here, I agree with Hawking on that. If they came here, I would, grab my wife and a bunch of frozen pizza and head for the hills. But the fact that we're listening, there's no danger in that, right? When you tune in KCUR here, you don't have to worry that the DJ is going to jump in the car next to you and start giving you a hard time. They don't know that you've tuned them in. So that's a passive experiment. Is it dangerous to broadcast? You could make that argument if you wanted to, but, and this was the point I was trying to make on that show, never got around to making the point because he couldn't, but that is, if you really are paranoid about this, if you're worried about this, it's too late. It's too late, because we've been broadcasting for 60 years. And while those signals are quite weak, any society that has the capability to come here and ruin your whole day, right, has more than enough capability